Hello friends, so today's lecture is about structuralism. The key names are Ferdinand de Saussure, Charles Peirce, the American philosopher. The Saussure, we have been talking about him all along, and he is a Swiss linguist. We will be talking about the language system, langue and parole, two concepts given to us by Saussure. We will also talk about science, the way Saussure talks about, and what is meant by signifier and signified. Structuralism is concerned with theories which are focused on the analysis of the surface structure of a system in terms of its underlying structure, and that system could be anything. We will be talking about it in detail soon. Structuralism developed out of the works of the formalists, and the two theories of formalism and structuralism overlap. While formalism is concerned with the devices and rules that go into the making of cultural artifacts, with the author actively employing techniques to achieve specific ends, structuralists, however, are concerned with the framework of meaning, how a spectator or reader reads and understands signs within a text. So, this is important to understand. Formalism is concerned with the rules that go into the making of cultural artifacts, a text for example, whereas structuralists are more concerned with how a meaning is conveyed and how a reader or a spectator, it can be extended to cinema as well. So, cinematic text, and how a movie viewer watches a film, or how a reader reads a text and how they understand signs within a text. Structuralists are interested on the workings of the human perception, and the basic premise of structuralism is that human activity and its products, even perceptions and thought itself, are constructed and not natural. And by doing this, they were challenging certain established norms about the way meaning is constructed and how meaning is derived. So, structure is the principle of construction and the object of analysis to be understood by its intimate reference to the concepts of system and value as defined in semiotics. So, this is another domain that we venture into while talking about structuralism, and how closely connected it is to the study of semiotic, which is the study of science. So, therefore, language system, science, and then two more important concepts related to science, the signifier and the signified. Now, each element has meaning according to the structuralists in the options, and therefore defined against the background of other possibilities. This is a radical view of meaning, that meanings are arbitrary and not previously constructed for us. Structuralism derives a lot from the works of Ferdinand de Saussure and Charles Peirce. While Saussure favors signs, Peirce prefers the word symbol. Saussure makes a basic difference between langue and parole. Langue, what is langue? Langue is the social aspect of language. It is the shared system which we draw upon as speakers. So, langue is the social aspect of language. Parole is the individual realization of the system in actual instances of language. So, langue is the social aspect, it is the shared system, and parole is the actual instance. That is the key basic difference. The right of linguistic or the right aim or right objective of linguistic study is the system which underlies any particular human signifying practice, not the individual utterance. For Saussure, language is a system of signs. This is what you have to remember. Language is a system of signs, and these signs are arbitrary. That means random and defined by difference from other words. Now, these signs can only be understood within a cultural system. I am just telling you what is meant by Saussure's system of language and signs. So, according to him, these signs and these systems can only be understood within a cultural system. Therefore, the arbitrariness of language. For example, and this is a famous example given to us by Saussure, the word dog, D-O-G, is not common to all languages. The French for dog, the French word for dog is chien, whereas in for the Germans, in the German language, the word for a dog is Hund, H-U-N-D. Although all these words refer to the same animal, an animal that has 4 legs, sharp teeth, that wags its tail, and so on. So you know the image of a dog that barks, yeah. So all these things. So, but every cultural system has its own specific word to describe this animal. Within each culture, there has to be a consensus. Everybody should agree that this animal should be referred to as a dog or as a chien or something else. So, it's culture specific, and there has to be a consensus that certain letters in a particular order serve to represent a certain creature. Okay, so this is important. Saussure states that there are only differences, that language is only a series of phonetic, that is sound. Phonetic, I am sure you are aware of, is study of sound. So, phonetic differences matched with series of conceptual, that is images. So, how sound matches images, that defines meaning. So, by this he means that each sign only has a meaning because it is different from others. Dog has no inherent meaning. Its meaning comes because of the way the alphabets have been arranged, and I can give example from the English language, D-O-G. Let's assume that the words, the alphabets are arranged as F-O-G, it becomes fog, or D-O-T, it becomes a dot. So, the sounds and the order of those letters, they explain, they define our conception of a particular creature or an object, and that leads and that gives us its meaning. Now, what is sign? The sign communicates information. You say dog and you conceptualize the image. So, it can be anything, sign can be anything, it can be an image, it can be a gesture. We will be talking about these things later on in this lecture. It can be a word written or spoken, it can be a shape or color. So, all these things are imbued with certain meanings. So, these are signs and they convey meanings. The sign is the first step in the process of interpretation. However, signs have no intrinsic meaning. Meaning is given to them and established by universal or cultural conventions. A sign has to stand for something else. Let us assume that a sign such as this is a plus sign for most of us. It can also mean something else. You see, let's assume you are holding a remote control in your hands and there is this button. So, it does not definitely says that add something to it. It stands for increasing the volume, increase the sound. So, a sign is determined by cultural, the meaning of a sign is determined by cultural conventions. A sign has to stand for something else. It has no meaning in itself. The sign is comprised of two components, the signifier and the signified, and these are two important concepts, two important components of sign, and we will be looking at these in detail as well. The signifier is the form that the sign takes. For example, a specific sound or marks on a piece of paper. The signified is the conceptual stage of communication. This is when the sign stimulates a mental idea or image. The discipline of semiotics plays an important role in structuralist literary theory and cultural studies. Semioticians apply structuralist insights to the study of sign systems. A non-linguistic object or behavior that can be analyzed as if it were a language. Specifically, semiotics examines the ways non-linguistic objects and behaviors tell us something. Semiotics takes off from Peirce, Charles Peirce, for whom language is one of numerous sign systems, and structuralism takes off basically from Saussure, for whom language was the sign system, and he tells us that language is a sign system par excellence. Prior to Saussure, language had been thought of simply as a system for naming objective reality, which was assumed to exist before and outside of language itself. Within this way of thinking, the real world is clearly already there, while language simply labels it all. So, you see there is a system before Saussure and after Saussure, post and pre. Pre-Saussure period, language was thought of simply as a way of naming things, objects, and it existed as a sort of objective reality. For Saussure, the social element of language constitutes the field of semiology. Coming to semiotics, this is the general science of signs. So, science of signs, this was pioneered in the 1880s by Charles Sanders Peirce, and we will discuss the philosophy, the language systems as proposed by Saussure and Charles Peirce further in our class on semiotics. When we apply the linguistic model to literature and literary criticism, we need to first understand that literature uses language as its medium. However, this does not mean that the structure of literature is identical with the structure of language. Structuralists believe that literature has a special relationship with language. So, see, we are moving towards that period in literary criticism, in literary history, in literary criticism and theory, where language and literature started to have a sort of correlation. Okay, earlier it was always there, but people had not theorized it, people had not talked about it, and this started taking place after, especially after Saussure. So, literature draws attention to the very nature and specific properties of language. Therefore, we can say that structuralism is closely related to formalism. So, the first to apply Saussure's ideas about language were the Russian formalists such as Roman Jakobson, Boris Eichenbaum and Viktor Shklovsky. These are the academicians particularly associated with the Moscow linguistic circle. Structuralist principles have been used to formulate general rules to distinguish literary from non-literary discourse. So, this is the importance of structuralism. Now, Roman Jakobson outlined the 3 stages of formalist research. He talks about analysis of the sound aspects of a literary work. Secondly, he talks about problems of meaning within the framework of poetics, and thirdly, he talks about an integration of sound and meaning into an inseparable whole. The formalist study of literature occurs within the more generalist study of language, which Jakobson categorizes in terms of its functions. So, another important word that you should know, Roman Jakobson and the theory of functions. The main elements of this functional system are the addresser and addressee. In between are a complex set of determinants that include context, message, contact and a code known to both the addresser and the addressee. Addresser, the person who addresses, addressee, the interlocutor. So, the main elements of the functional system are the addresser and the addressee, and there is a complex set of determinants that include context, message and contacts. Jakobson talks about 2 axes or levels of meaning upon which poetry draws the metaphoric and selective, and the metonymic and combinative. So, these are the terms that we should know. For Jakobson, the poetic function projects the principle of equivalence from the axis of selection into the axis of combination. Jakobson means that in poetry, selection made on the level of metaphor are superinduced onto the level of metonymy, where they are combined with other words to create poetic effects. Jakobson's definition departs from the simple fact that all words can be classified and categorized. To give an example of what Roman Jakobson means by super induction of language, let us take a word for which there is a perfect synonym. Okay, let us think blossom can also be seen thought of as flower, that is a synonym. Why would a poet, a writer use a particular word, a flower in some context and a blossom in another? So, that is the idea. So, we will have to choose between 2 equivalents. Which word we choose depends on exactly what kinds of emotions we want to project, what kinds of emotions, what kinds of language we want to project, whether it is too dignified language or too colloquial language. All these things depend exactly specifically on the words that a poet chooses. It is this principle of linguistic equivalence that poetry borrows from what Jakobson terms as the axis of combination. Coming to Viktor Shklovsky, his work on prose as a formal device reflects some of the innovations offered by Jakobson. Shklovsky held that the artistic work of art is autonomous, free from social forces, and that prose is essentially form. So, Viktor Shklovsky defining what is form. Shklovsky gives us the term defamiliarization, which is also called estrangement, and these things we have been doing in quite some detail all along. So, defamiliarization. Defamiliarization, as perhaps we have already done, is an artistic device that explains the alienating effect of things most familiar to us and raises the question whether reality is or isn't purely an effect. Another device that defamiliarizes the objects of representation is the laying bare a text of the author's techniques. Another important writer of structuralism, and we owe a lot to this person, Claude Lévi-Strauss. He is a structuralist anthropologist who developed a structural theory in a consideration of myth, ritual and traditions. He explains social structure as a kind of model and demonstrates that the behavior patterns and institutes depend on methods of communication that are all characteristics of how the human mind works. Lévi-Strauss, for example, analyzes the Oedipus myth in a manner which is truly structuralist. Lévi-Strauss is more interested in a structural pattern than in the narrative sequence. His theories about myth had great influence in the development of the theory of narratology, a further aspect of structuralism. We will soon be looking at it. Now, another key writer of this movement, this thought, is Vladimir Propp, who pursued the analogy between the sentence structure and narrative and developed his theory of Russian fairy tales and fairy stories. His approach can be understood if we compare the subject of a sentence with the typical characters, the hero, the heroine, villains, etc. Propp talks about 31 functions, where a function is the basic unit of the narrative language and refers to the significant actions which form the narrative. These follow a logical sequence. The last group of functions is a difficult task is proposed to the hero, the task is resolved. The hero is recognized, the false hero or villain is exposed, the false hero is given a new appearance, the villain is punished, the hero is married and ascends the throne. Now, consider the Oedipus myth through the same prism of explanation. Now, Oedipus is challenged with the task of solving the riddle of the Sphinx. He resolves it, he provides the solution. So, the hero is recognized and he is married, he ascends that throne, but that it does not end there, because Oedipus, as we know, after all, is a false hero. He is the one who killed inadvertently his father and married his mother. So, he is a false hero, he is exposed and he punishes himself. At the same time, balance and harmony is restored at the end of Oedipus. So, the last structuralist who I am going to refer to in today's class is Jean Piaget. He discusses the three components, or rather the three key components of the concept of a structure. The view of a system as a whole instead of several and many parts, the study of the transformations in the system and the fact that these transformations never lead beyond the system, but always engender elements that belong to it and preserve its laws. Piaget illustrates the concept as it appears in mathematics and logic, physics and biology, psychology, and he relates the idea of structuralism to the laws of Gestalt and the structure of intelligence. And Piaget's works have also influenced linguistics, where he dwells further on synchronicity and generative grammar. So, what have we learned? We have looked at certain key thinkers of early structuralism. We have seen who was Saussure, Charles Peirce, Roman Jakobson, Claude Levi-Strauss, Jean Piaget. We have also become familiar with Prop and Victor Shklovsky. We will continue with structuralism in another part of this lecture. Thank you.